Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Veronica, and I am an OCM for the Eastern European Society here at Trinity. I am delighted to welcome you to the lecture in this special series, Understanding Europe's East. And just before we start, there's going to be a few words on housekeeping. So in the unlikely event of an emergency, there are 2 escape exits located at the back of the room. We won't have to use them, but just for your information. Also, if I may request everyone to set their phone in silent mode and to turn off any alarms. Lastly, we aim for today's lecture to last about 40 minutes, after which we will open the floor for our audience to ask questions. We may need to stay here sometime past 7 to answer the questions, but if you need to get going at 7, that's completely fine as well. Just please exit quietly via one of the doors. Also, a couple of words about our society. So, we were founded with the aim of promoting the rich cultural heritage of Eastern Europe. So it is a great pleasure to see events like this taking place. I myself am Polish, and I'm very excited for today's topic, which is very, very important, as I'm sure all of you realize. And we are presenting this series together with the DU History Society, Trinity Center of Resistance Studies, and the Department of Russian and Slavonic Studies. And now I will invite Connor Daly from the department to say a few words about the lecture series.
Thank you very much, Veronica, and good evening, dzień dobry wieczór wszystkim. Witamy na naszym wykładzie, and on behalf of my fellow organizers, that's Balázs Opor, Krzysztof Rowiński, and myself, I'd like to welcome you to what is the 9th lecture in our series, Understanding Resistance in Europe's East. I'm going to be handing straight back to Veronica, but before I do that, because Veronica's going to be introducing this evening's speaker, I'd like to recap briefly the rationale for the series and the story so far. So the series this year is inspired by the work of the Trinity Center for Resistance Studies, set up by Balázs 4 years ago to provide an intellectual response to the growth of populism and authoritarianism worldwide. Unfortunately, perhaps given current trends, interest in that topic is likely to intensify before it eventually subsides. So in the first lecture, we heard Graham Murdoch identifying the eastern part of Europe for us as a laboratory for the study of resistance in the modern period, because that region had intense experience during the 20th century of both fascism and communism alike. Tanya Lokot then took us through the nature of grassroots resistance in today's Ukraine, where citizens use social media tools to assert their agency in a struggle to assert themselves, their own sovereignty against an irredentist Russia. Then Dimitar Komborov highlighted the unusual case of how in late communist Bulgaria, both dissident culture and establishment culture found themselves using the same platforms, that there was a single canon tolerated by and accepted by the authorities. Then Jana Fischerova told us how protest in communist Czechoslovakia was a lived expression of the concept of truth and personal authenticity as manifested in Czech culture from the time of Jan Hus. Jackie Hayden then gave us a front seat of her own experiences in meetings with Polish leaders from the 1980s, from Lech Wałęsa to Wojciech Jaruzelski. And Jackie emphasized for us the real achievement of the roundtable talks which took place at that time as an alternative to bloody unrest. Then Balázs Opor took us through Hungarian rock, rap and punk, audio and video from the 1980s to the present. And he used that to show us how popular music genres became a catalyst, or have become a catalyst for the expression of oppositional sentiment in the Hungarian political context. And he compared that to the sonic resistance trends that we saw in the US during the Vietnam War, and the uncanny recurrence under Viktor Orban of the kind of risky song lyrics, and even the same performers, the very same bands who had already lit up the Hungarian People's Republic during the 1980s. I talked about 3 dissidents I got to know in the Soviet Union of the 1980s, people whose humorous and humane life philosophies were grounded in the desire not to pay lawlessness back in the same coin on the one hand, and then a consciousness or a naive trust that the human rights principles of the Helsinki Accords would always be there to be relied on to protect them. And then finally, last week, Krzysztof Rowinski showed us how Polish performance artists, a generation apart, Ewa Partum and Liliana Zeitz, in their conscious non-belonging, illustrate a striking continuity in the strategies used by Polish women to deal with oppression, whether the source of that oppression be religious or secular or both. And still to come next week, we've got a roundtable discussion on the 10th of April, and you're all very welcome to come back for that. Now, just before I hand back to Veronica, important to point out that our series is part funded by the TCD Faculty Events Fund and the Faculty's Visiting Professor Fund. And I also want to acknowledge the excellent support of three of the college's student societies in promoting our series and in chairing the lectures, so the History Society, the Ukrainian Society, and tonight's hosts, the Eastern European Society. So I'm going to hand back now to Weronika Romańska, who's tonight's Master of Ceremonies, so she can introduce our speaker. Thank you, Veronica.
Thank you so much, Colin. So now to introduce our speaker, the title of today's lecture by Dr. Ewa Majewska is Counterpublics of the Common Early Solidarność, Women's Strike and the Queer Mobilizations. Professor Ewa Majewska is a philosopher, political activist, feminist theorist of culture, and a prolific author. She is currently associate professor at the SWPS University in Warsaw, where she has lectured in gender studies since 2003. Ewa will be speaking to us this evening about different visions for resistance in a Polish context, as manifested in protest movements in Poland over the past nearly 50 years. She will be showing us some alternatives to the traditional patriarchal images of brave man conquering the other. And now I will hand over the microphone to our lovely speaker. Please give a round of applause for Ewa Majewska.
Thank you so very much for this kind introduction. Can you hear me well? Okay, good. Thank you again. Thank you, Connor. Thank you, Krzysztof. Thank you, Balázs, for having me here. Thank you, everyone, for coming, especially in this beautiful weather, which I'm very amazed of. So this is what you this is the typical weather of Ireland, right? Fantastic. I love our country. It's amazing, and I'm sorry I don't speak any Gaelic or Irish. Otherwise, I would welcome you in that language, but I can say in Polish, dobry wieczór, or in English, good evening. And I would like to thank you for making this series of lectures, also because it reminds not just of East European failures, but also about of how we can use those failures. So it's fantastic, actually, that we are sharing in those lectures the specificity, the maybe even inventiveness of that region, and not only the failures. Usually when people are asked to talk from Central Eastern Europe, they're kind of codified as, you know, a little bit weaker or less important region of Europe or the world, actually. And therefore here I have the pleasure to share with you some strategies that might be effective. What you see on the image, by the way, is Ewa Partum's work from the series of self-identification. And I sort of happened to have quite a nice little career while interpreting this image and the rest of the series. And the paradox is that it was somehow accidental how it happened. I looked at the date, so 1980. I was very interested because somehow nobody made any, you know, any comments on this date. So I looked further, and the premiere, the opening of the exhibition where she first presented these works, took place in March 1980. So I made a part of my interpretation of this artist's career, and I discussed it with Krzysztof, who, as Connor said, works on this artist's artwork. For me, this image and other images of this series are sort of an expression of a tendency that the whole society is going to explicitly announce in August the same year. So in March 1980, Ewa Partum says that there is no place for women in art history and art practice. So she's going to perform naked until this place is granted to women. So she wanted to be participating in the creation of art and culture. She wanted to be noticed, visible, and she wanted to have agency, not just to be passive, you know, wife of an artist or otherwise decorative element, as women often were reduced to that kind of inactive position. So she announces this desire for agency, for fully embracing the life and creativity in March 1980, and then in August 1980, I would say the rest of Polish society also says the same thing, basically, that they want to have a place in the governance, in the management of factories, of the state, of the country, and they do it by means of strike. By the way, a solidarity strike with another woman, Anna Walentynowicz, crane operator from the shipyard of Gdańsk, as we might remember. So somehow the woman becomes the reason of the strike that led to so many important changes. How do I change the slides here? That's my question. Okay, thank you. Yeah, fantastic. So this is the continuation of self-identification cycle. This one might remind you of Louis Althusser's theory of interpellation from ideology and ideological state apparatus. This is where the subject making, subject formation is defined by the interpellation of the power. So when the policeman or woman in this case tells you, hey, you, and you turn to them, this is how you produce, you are produced, but also you produce yourself as subjectivity. So this concept is not speaking of autonomous subject versus the bad oppressive power, but Althusser and later also Michel Foucault, also Pierre Bourdieu, and all other French philosophers and sociologists are going to speak about how in the interaction, so they actually repeat the major gesture of Hegelian dialectics, but they don't know it, and they are usually anti-Hegelian declaratively. But in fact, what they speak of as dialectics is the formation of subjectivity in relation with its context. And here, Eva Partum, not knowing Althusser's text, I asked her about it. She didn't know it. She sort of reproduces the situation, but she also shows the woman the policewoman, so basically somebody who in many other countries would not take this job in 1980, and in Poland, women were emancipated enough to do this kind of jobs and many others. Okay, in philosophical, but back to the topic of my presentation. Okay, one more, and I love talking about art, so I could basically do it on and on, but I'll just explain one more. And so this is Zorka Wolny's Ophelias, the iconography of madness. It was actually a performance, but you can see online still, if you type Zorka Wolny Ophelias, you're going to see a video, 30 minutes of a shortcut of 1 hour and a half performance, in which 12 actresses of different ages, starting from 25, ending in 80 something years old, who had the experience previously of playing Ophelia in any of the Polish theaters where they lived, so in different methodologies, in different decades, basically. It started in the 60s and then went on. Because it's usually, as you know, usually it's young women who play Ophelia. So this woman, actress who was like 80 something, she must have played her Ophelia, I don't know, in the 60s or 70s. So all these actresses, they enter the stage and they do Ophelia. And they do it in those different methodologies and ways. And I was asked by Zorka Wolny to write a text for a catalog of this. And I was like, Zorka, I work with different women. I work with Antigones, you know, this kind of more brave, maybe Medea. But these guys, I don't know much about. And she said, and that was really interesting, okay, I have specialists. So I have feminist scholars who specialize in Ophelias. We have one, Katarzyna Czeczot, fantastic person, wrote her dissertation on Ophelias, and she's really like specialist. But I want you, so the person who is working with more antagonistic and antagonistic feminine subjectivities, to write about Ophelias as well, because this is a different approach. And then I was like, that might be interesting, let me try it. And I was watching this performance. So basically it consists in different women. I think I had two, but I had to make smaller, but there was 12 of them. And I was watching those Ophelias and thinking, okay, there is one thing they all have in common, which is that these are the voices and the performances and the embodiments that we would never see in a classical mainstream public sphere. These voices, so the voices of hysteria, of madness, of sorrow, of affect, of attachment, of relationality, these voices are not permitted in the male-dominated, as we say in feminist context, mainstream classical public sphere. So also the bourgeois public sphere that Jürgen Habermas and other authors are talking about, and also in most of our experiences of political debate, these kind of voices, no. So I wrote precisely about Ophelic counterpublics and about what the public sphere, what kind of conditions the public sphere should accomplish in order to be inclusive. Because obviously, as you all know, I think various forms of discrimination, so the colonial discrimination, racist discrimination, homophobic discrimination, transphobic discrimination, all kinds of them, they are very similar and they are based on this exclusion of femininity and the feminine in patriarchal culture. So my argument in many places is that this patriarchal scenario is repeated. So this has been also very prolific in the exclusion of Jews, for instance, in the fascist times of Nazi Germany and other places which Germany occupied, where the stereotypes and the bias expressed towards the Jewish communities and population was actually very similar to what was said about women in the ultra-conservative fundamentalist discourse. So this is what those young and old women perform, and this is what makes it very particular. So in philosophical discourse, resistance has been portrayed as symptomatic of the negative in philosophy, in historical panorama, therefore announcing the appearance of exception, of violation of existing patterns, or simply spectacular change. So resistance is usually portrayed, as we said in the opening little chapter, little teaser, as often a man on a horse, or otherwise a brave figure that enters history and makes a fantastic change. And usually this figure is detached from the rest of the society, so a little bit like this one. But this one is speaking about her relationships. The traditional hero of political agency narrative in political philosophy, in political history, etc., also in our history books, it's the men who enter on horses very often and just conquer the territory or conquer the other. This definition of oppositional politics as exception and produced by extraordinary subjects has been fetishized to an extent that makes it unimaginable for any agency of lesser heroism than a genuine avant-garde to cause political change. Perceived in strictly individualistic terms, resistance is only imaginable as caused by extraordinary agents acting bravely, explicitly announcing their claims in what can be classified as rational discourse. So this is another field of exclusion, basically, who qualifies as rational subject, so who can produce claims. And obviously there is a very nice line of thinkers and activists, but thinkers are interesting for us now, maybe a little bit more, so I'm going to speak of thinkers, who only attribute rationality to those who can use political discourse and who can do what I would say commit a detachment, a mistake of detachment. But in the classical traditional political theory, it would be actually they express their ability of distancing themselves from the matters of everyday. So in this discourse, in this context, public debate and public sphere is a space of debate in which rational subjects discuss the matters, the common matters, the matters important for everyone, in a very specific narrative. And this is what distinguishes the bourgeois public sphere from, let's say, the proletarian public sphere, where the workers, first of all, do not present the competence in this highly specialized political discourse, but also they dare discussing such everyday, mundane, ordinary matters as their salaries. What a scandal. For a bourgeois public sphere, the bourgeois don't discuss their income. It's a private matter. It's oikonomics. From Greek language, oikos is the house, the household. So what is in the household does not enter public sphere. And this we know already from antiquity. So this is Aristotelian definition of the public debate and public discourse. And Aristotle also gave us, Aristotle in English, right? Aristotle, sorry, gave us also the definition of who is this zone politikon, who is this political animal, who is the proper human. It is a person who used to live in Athens since 3 generations. So here it sounds a little bit Nazi, no? But unfortunately, but this is what he says. So a person Athenian since 3 generations, rich enough not to be worried about daily needs. That's another feature of the bourgeois, of the member of the bourgeois public sphere. So they don't have to worry about their basic needs. They have others to do this work for them. So they have servants, or they have a wife, or they have others, slaves perhaps. By the way, for Aristotle, a slave is a tool. It's not a human, right? So this is this noble philosopher who even Hannah Arendt, of all people, was celebrating so much. No, it's for me it's incomprehensible how you can celebrate Aristotle as political thinker, knowing that he majorly contributed to the misunderstanding and devaluation of human beings who were enslaved. So, but coming back to Aristotle, so women, children, not only slaves, but also because slaves are not human at all for Aristotle, but also those humans who are in servant positions, they are also not proper members of the public sphere. So as you see, this definition of 1% is actually has actually a very antique origin, because I would say it was maybe 5% of the Athenian population who could actually participate in the public debate. And then, okay, it's been already half an hour. I have to really, so let me, okay. You can read it already, although it's a little bit of a spoiler alert. this is only coming. So, because first I wanted to give you the public sphere. So this very classical concept of the public sphere has been also practiced in this Republican philosophy of the French Enlightenment. So Jacques Rousseau and other people like that would also think that it is the bourgeois, the person who has sufficient status to participate in the public debate, to participate in it. And then we have Olympia de Gouges, the French revolutionary actually writer, journalist, we could say today, who wrote this Universal Declaration of the Rights of a Woman as opposed to the Declaration of Universal Rights that the French Revolution gave to the men, not humans, but men. So she wrote the Declaration of the Women. In French, it's similar as in English. Yeah? So it was Déclaration de l'homme, the droit de l'homme, and she made the Déclaration de droit de femme, and she was decapitated. Rumor has it for this pamphlet, but apparently she wrote many other pamphlets which disagreed with the second or third, let's say, generation within the French revolutionary changes of political shifts. Anyhow, so the definition of public sphere, the mainstream definition of public sphere, has been shaped accordingly to the needs of those who were, I would say, socialized and culturally perceived as men, but not all of them, also privileged men, and also white men, of course, especially in the United States of America of 19th and early 20th century, also still now, as many people claim, and I'm sorry to say, rightfully, the people of color have oftentimes much lesser access to the public sphere simply, and their lives might be threatened as well, which doesn't help to debate basically. So there is that. And then there are different theorists whose work has been important for the public sphere. In my line of thinking, and you will understand why in a second, maybe the most interesting take on the bourgeois public sphere comes from Jürgen Habermas, the German philosopher, who in 1962 wrote his was habilitation work, I believe, called Transformation of the Public Sphere. And in this work, he basically repeats Aristotelian claims. And he says also, which triggered a very long line of responses, that he will focus only on the bourgeois public sphere because the plebeian publics did not have sufficient historical influence and importance. And this is the moment which 10 years later, in 1972, two authors, Alexander Kluge and Oskar Necht, oh, there we go, sorry. Alexander Kluge and Oskar Necht, so the second line, and Kluge you might know for his movies. He's much celebrated, I think, because he tried to film The Capital of Karl Marx. 9 hours, one of the most boring movies I've ever seen. But but it's also beautiful and it's sincere and honest in its appreciation. So these two critical thinkers, Kluge was a student of Theodor Adorno. This is also how I can make it familiar for you maybe. So they wrote The Public Sphere and Experience, the amazing book, The Analysis of the Bourgeois and Proletarian Public Sphere. So then they enter factories and they write a theory which I found incredibly appropriate to use to analyze Solidarność movement. Because this is what precisely the workers in Gdańsk and later in other cities did in 1980. They sat down and started to debate the public matters, the common, their life, their salaries, their participation or lack of it, of participation in democracy, how they want to have their country defined, who they want to govern the country, and why they all should, participate in it, etc., etc. So Kluge and Knecht disagree with Habermas on several important points. First of all, obviously, they want the public sphere to truly belong to everyone, because the very definition of public sphere is contradictory. It's a space of debate of matters important for everyone, so for the common, but yet only some very exceptional individuals get to participate in this debate. So Kluge and Knecht are like, okay, we cannot exclude all the factory workers. There are too many of them. And also historically, they have been too important. And they give examples of 19th century workers' movement changed the face of the earth, basically, as we can say, following a very important figure from Polish history. So this was this disagreement. And later, probably they have read Nancy Fraser, so the next author I have listed here. Nancy Fraser wrote about the feminist counterpublics and the subaltern counterpublics as well in her article Rethinking the Public Sphere from 1990. So somehow, interestingly, she does not quote Kluge and Knecht, and she uses the word counterpublics, so that was interesting for me, but I believe she sort of corrected it later, and it's very good for her. And for her, the feminist movement of United States of America actually is a better example of public sphere than what is usually understood as public sphere, because she says the public sphere cannot be one, it has to be many. So for her, and I like this argument very much, and I believe that it's a very open argument for Kluge and Knecht, and this embracing of the factory workers, maybe some people politically inclined in a more conservative way might find it difficult, but I believe that even for a rather conservative person, this idea that public spheres should be many and should be in the process of negotiation might be attractive. So I'm finding this a very open argument, I would say. And she speaks of feminist movement as a good example of counterpublics, because feminist movement in the United States of America, but also globally, is incredibly diverse and very often contradictory on its own. So this, for Habermas, would mean a weakness. And Habermas is still in a very patriarchal mindset when he writes this, I think, because it seems like as if he really wanted to have this triumphant, strong, indivisible, and undivided public sphere, while for Fraser, who is a genuine Democrat, the importance is to have this conflict and to maintain it. So within feminist movement, which can fight for the rights of women, there can be pro and anti-pornographic fractions, for instance, or there can be, I don't know, people who are willing to open feminism to LGBTQ persons or not, which is maybe not the most tolerant and definitely not my favorite position, but still she speaks of those differences as ones that, albeit they might be experienced as very problematic, still do not weaken feminism as a movement. So feminism goes towards getting more rights for women, even if on the inside there is a debate or about sex work, very heated debate, incredible. Right now, I think even more important than in the 90s. And still, feminist movement with those debates can be a strong field of democratic debate. Michael Warner in Publics and Counterpublics, which are actually, this one is a book from 2002, but earlier I think he published an article which is also incredibly rich. In the book, he speaks of Black counterpublics. So he recapitulates the history of people of color's mobilizations in the United States as a counterpublics, which was also quite effective. And then we have the Commonwealth of Tony Negri and Michael Hart. And here on a personal note, I must say that I had a big discussion with Tony Negri, first about Solidarność, because for Tony Negri and for the Italian operaist thinkers, Solidarność was the entrance of neoliberal capitalism in Europe. So they sort of neglected the early days of Solidarność, when it comes to life as a child of a strike, let's say, when it's incredibly democratic and grassroots, etc., etc. So when it fulfills all that they want to say appreciatively about the common. So it was our work back in Warsaw, I think, of me and my friends, to make Negri and Hart return to the topic of Solidarność in their book, The Assembly, from 2017, and putting Solidarność somewhere between the Zapatista movement and I think the feminist movement, somewhere over there. So this shift of location, you can remember as one to which I also contributed by bringing Tony Negri to Warsaw. So maybe in Warsaw it was more difficult for him to disagree with me because it was my ground, not his. So I don't know, but somehow it so happened that in the next book we saw Solidarność appreciated, at least for the early stage of it. So then, Jane Fonda, one of the great supporters of Solidarność, so this is why I bring her here, but also her experiences of being an incredible star, movie star and pop culture star as well, but also a very politically involved person. So this shows you also how contradictory the public sphere can be and how contradictory also the participants of the public sphere can be. This is a photograph from one of the women's protests in 2015. This is something that maybe for some of us might ring a nice sentimental note. So it's one of the clandestine samizdat workshop where people were, all this was illegal basically because the photo comes from 1984 or something. So Solidarność was illegal there, so reprinting. And I took a picture in a museum. So basically what you see in the background is the photograph, and then these two people in front, they are other visitors. So it's, history works through it. Okay, why do I show all of this? I'm showing all of this because in the context of weak resistance, we must think about what it means to be weak for resistance. So one of the factors that make resistance weak is that it's diverse and contradictory. So it's precisely one of the features of counterpublics. The counterpublics are many and they often fight among themselves. And this is one of the options. So what we see here is actually emblematic, incredibly important images for several different decades and generations of Polish resistors, I would say. So the photo on which you see on the left is one by Tomasz Sarnecki. It's the poster for electoral campaign of the first semi-democratic elections that took place on the 4th of June 1989 in Poland. So you see a reproduction of the very famous movie poster. But then the Croatian artist Sanja Ivekovic in 2009 saw this picture and she was like, okay, that's excluding women. Let me remake the image in a better way. So there was already here a controversy because Solidarność labor union became incredibly conservative over the years. And they had something against her reproducing the image in such a way. Then we have the Black protest movement appropriating Sanja Ivekovic's image, also with a little bit of a controversy because in the first step, the Museum of Modern Art, the owner of Ivekovic's work, was kind of doubtful whether they can reproduce. So Sanja said, of course you can reproduce it, it's feminist fight, la la la. And then we have a plethora of uses of Solidaryca, which is the name of the letters of the font, invented by Jerzy Janiszewski and his wife Krystyna Janiszewska. So these two people invented the fonts that were originally workers in different poses. So this is where the font comes from. Later it became more like a painted sign, but the first version of Solidarność logo was actually the workers. So we have all kinds of appropriations, and none of these people claimed their rights to their image, but the Solidarność labor union actually claimed this logo, and they took women activists from Gdańsk to court over the copyright to the logo of their union. And then Jerzy Janiszewski, the author of the logo, entered the stage and he said, no, anyone who wants to fight for freedom and equality can use the logo. So I gave my logo to the Solidarność labor union, but not exclusively. So it's a very nice, I'm very fond of people who contest the restrictive version of copyright. I think it's important that we share knowledge and therefore, and creativity and artistic production. And I really appreciate Jerzy Janiszewski saying that Solidarność should be used by anyone who fights for similar ideals that Solidarność original movement did. Also, Henryka Krzywonos, one of the most important Solidarność members, a tramway driver who, on one hand, stopped her tramway in the middle of the city of Gdańsk in 1980 and claimed that this tramway ain't going any further. And she asked people to spread the news of the strike in shipyards of Gdańsk. This woman became a very active member of the Czarny protest movement and very important figure of the anti-PiS, anti-Kaczyński opposition, which is a paradox because she used to be Kaczyński's colleague in early Solidarność, no? So it's kind of, on personal note, it's kind of difficult to have this kind of fight. But still, she said that she could go to jail for this one. She already was persecuted in the 80s, so she has the experience. So if any of the young feminists, are endangered, she will gladly take the fight. Okay, I have to return to the slides with, I don't know how it jumped so Okay, weak resistance now. And I should finish probably soon. Okay. Can I still go for like 10 minutes? Yeah. Okay, so weak resistance, main inspirations. I have a beautiful passage from Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, who write about the beginnings of territory, the beginnings of artistic adventure or creating of the state as well, in an incredibly beautiful way. So I'm going to read from a text. As we might remember, the new beginnings in Deleuze and Guattari's mid-plateau are not marked by any heroic masculine figure claiming their rights or fighting for them. They actually start in a sort of Kafkan moment of deception and weakness, in confrontation with an overwhelming fear or danger, where the scariest is perhaps the possibility of literally anything happening. Let's recall the image, and now I quote from mid-plateau. A child in the dark, gripped with fear, comforts himself by singing under his breath. He walks and holds to his song. Lost, he takes shelter or orients himself with his little song as best as he can. The song is like a rough sketch of a calming and stabilizing, calm and stable center of the heart of chaos. Perhaps the child skips as he sings, hastens or slows his pace, but the song itself is already a skip. It jumps from chaos to the beginnings of order in chaos and is in danger of breaking apart at any moment. There is always sonority in Ariadne's thread, or the Song of Orpheus. End of quote. So I gave you this image of a frightened child who consoles himself by singing. So not by fighting, not by kicking everything around him, but by entering to himself and sort of trying to build this little song, because I think it's a very nice beginning of an entity. It can be a movement, it can be one person's individual courage in some circumstances, but also it's an image of unheroic resistance. So this person clearly resists to the fear, to the potential danger, but they do it in such a way that is not aggressive towards the others. So this is where many people get the idea that weak resistance can only be pacifistic. We spoke about it over lunch with some of you. I think it's kind of an interesting topic for the discussion, so I'm going to leave it for later. So when I speak about weak resistance, I don't only mean pacifistic strategies, but I mean strategies that are not heroic. But being unheroic might also mean hysteric. And in hysteria, for instance, we might break some windows or some faces for that matter. So there is an element of aggressivity that can be maintained within the weak resistant acts, I would say. Then on my list of references, we got Václav Havel, the Czech film theater writer in general, who actually, I mean, my claim is that the poor liberal Havel sketched and drafted one of the most important communist or socialist mobilizations. No? So let's imagine Havel sitting in his apartment in Praha and writing this Power of the Powerless, this beautiful essay discussing acts of resistance that are still feasible, albeit the whole situation, the global context is speaking against it. So in Czechoslovakia of 1976, there was no hope of any major change in political constellation. The USSR was on one side, the US of A was on the other side. They were basically stagnating in their opposition to each other, and little people of Czechoslovakia or other countries of the Central European region, they didn't have much to do, and also the forces stationary, so the Soviet army stationary in Czechoslovakia already had shown that they can attack, right? So not everybody had the courage of running around with noble and heroic gestures. So Havel says, okay, we have an alternative here. We can either allow all these conditions to pacify our resistance, or we can try to resort to smaller gestures. We can not hang the flag when everybody hangs it. We can refuse to go to the 1st May marches, the obligation in communist system for the citizens. So many people didn't go because they liked the idea of workers, rights, but they went because they were threatened to lose their jobs or something. So Havel speaks of those acts of resistance, and then in the end of his essay, he speaks of that maybe those people who are like common, shop assistants. He writes about shopkeeper as the main example. So a very ordinary person. So maybe these ordinary resistors can unite in the end and create some bigger entity. And this is, I think, what happened in 1980 in Poland, basically, in August. No? It was very different people who were just saying, okay, I'm not going to work. If Anna Valentinowicz is fired, thank you very much. We're not working anymore. So this was quite a okay, it was heroic. Yeah, you can see a bravery, a courage in it, but also it was an ordinary gesture in some way. It was like, okay, we don't do it. We don't respect this decision. And then what happens? A mass of people. Actually, in March 1981, Solidarność counted 10 millions of officially registered members. And Poland at that time had the population of 36 millions. So almost 1/3 of the population inscribed officially into Solidarność. So Havel, I think he woke up, when all this happened, and was like, oh my God, what have I done? Because his essay was smuggled to Poland and translated through the mountains. Actually, my father and me, we were also part of the smuggling, maybe not of this one, but some later texts. As in 76, I wasn't yet born, so I can say, but in the 80s, we did cross this border several times with very different things. Then we have Henryka Krzywonos and this statement, this tramway ain't going any further. Then we have James Scott, for instance, the American anthropologist, anarchist anthropologist, actually, as he's very often defined, who theorized the struggles and the protests of the peasants in Far East Asia as ones that didn't even produce claims. So that were using very ordinary activity of just walking, basically, often without any banners. But then he was criticized because some other scholars went to Asia and investigated, and actually there were slogans, which was also my suspicion, because somehow I think that people actually do express verbally very often, even if they, even if these words might seem atypical for the political debate, or even if they seem strange or something. I mean, those slogans with the word wypierdalać is a slogan like go fuck yourselves. This is what the slogan means. So of course there was a huge debate in Poland about whether women should be allowed to use this slogan or not, whether it's nice, whether it's effective for us to do that. And then we had Professor Miodek, the leading Polish specialist in language sciences, who said that the situation demands this kind of wording. I love this guy. He's like, I don't know, 70 years old professor who is always very polite and very modest. So seeing him explaining that the situation currently demands this kind of strong language, and if we didn't use the strong language, we would falsify the reality. I think it was fantastic. I mean, we might disagree on that, but for me, it was one of the most interesting expressions, again, of very heroic, person who wanted to show their support for the women's protests, but also is not really a typical political activist. And my last reference, and I'm going to, I think, end on that note, is Jack Halberstam, earlier known as Judith Halberstam. So you might, because this book, The Queer Art of Failure, was still signed by Judith J. Halberstam, but now it's definitely J. Halberstam at male pronouns. So he wrote this book in 2010, using Stuart Hall's law theory to express his interest in resistance against neoliberalism, which is based on the assumption that mistakes, failures can be a form of resistance. So the logic, the reasoning of Halberstam in the book goes as follows. If neoliberalism is a system focused on productivity and effectivity, fetishizing success as the key notion and effectivity again, the person who is failing, so for instance, the person who is failing in their performance of gender, you might not see it, but I'm like 180 centimeters tall and quite fat. So sometimes if I do a very womanly makeup, some people look at me checking whether I'm actually what might be my gender and also biological sex. So I fail sometimes spectacularly in the performance of gender. So that would be one of the failures that Halberstam would appreciate and see as one of the kind of stopping points of effectivity. But he speaks also of B category movies and C category movies. So the movies that like Dumb and Dumber, right? The movies in which we don't maybe see fantastic heroic characters, but because of that, because of the lack of this male brave hero in the center, there is space for more queer characters. And that's interesting for Halberstam. But later he speaks also about Yoko Ono and other prominent artists and their performances, which also explore failure, fatigue, being tired. And he speaks also, and this is the favorite part for children, he speaks of anime and animated films in more generally as movies which precisely also convey very important queer message and which might be seen as resistance to capitalism because they don't emphasize, they embrace the weak, basically. They embrace the weak, the unheroic. And for me, and this is maybe the last note, for me, Jack Halberstam going towards this very anarchistic strategy. So seeing failure and also evasiveness, so also escapism as a form of resistance. You know, if we look at America today, under Trump, if we look at this administration and this educational sector being basically digested by right-wing fundamentalism, to say the least, then we might wonder what the LGBTQ communities and LGBTQ scholars more specifically could do to actually have more impact on institutions. So whether this escapism tended, and also another question which comes from me as somebody who has traveled a lot as academic, is there any more place for us to escape? We might not like neoliberal academia in UK or Poland or Ireland, but where do we go to? Because until recently, it was possible to go to places, but not anymore, I think. I think the global neoliberal academia is actually becoming very unified in its exclusion of anybody that is more contestant or more compliant, or less compliant and less inclined to accept the productivity norms. And okay, this is the last thing I wanted to say. Recently, I was invited to a conference about censoring academia, and we were with scholars from Iran, from Belarus, from places where people are really persecuted. And many of these people went through either prisons or jails or were fired or otherwise dramatically expelled from their countries. And the organizers, very nice American scholars, were speaking of success and success stories. And I couldn't stop myself from saying, listen, I love you guys. It's a fantastic conference. But can you please stop speaking about success here? Because some of us went through so much pain and sorrow, and we are maybe in a very weak position, but then there are others for whom our story is inspiring in a positive way, for instance. Or we manage being expelled abroad, otherwise, not in our original places, to actually help others. Or even if there are people who sacrificed their life, health, and other important things, they might set an example, so their failure might become success one day, or might be experienced as success. So this notion of failure and success, very neoliberal notions, I think, very emphasized within neoliberal sort of marketing of effectivity. Yeah, in this I agree with Jack Halberstam, that rethinking them and thinking of failure as a form of resistance makes a lot of sense. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope we have a discussion.